Perfect, because I changed something. Oh, and now it said it's recorded. So I'm trying to share the slides. So, and now everyone should see the presentation, just the presentation and myself probably in presentation mode. That's right. Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and a great thank you to the ReASoN network and the whole team for having me today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about a crucial topic for me, personally and professionally, specifically navigating ableist and neurotypical academia. In this respect, I would like to offer a critical perspective on the barriers, challenges, and opportunities for disabled scholars in the academy. My name is Marco Valero Sanchez, but Marco is absolutely fine. And I am a PhD candidate in sociology and disability study at Leibniz University Hanover in Germany. In today's presentation, I want to give you some insights into my PhD project, focusing on inclusion, participation, and ableism in academia. In particular, I am exploring lived experiences of disability disclosure, mental illness, and managing academic employment and career conditions. For this purpose, I have conducted a qualitative interview study with scholars with so-called invisible disabilities. Beyond my research project, my talk will include some personal references to navigating the academy as a disabled and neurodivergent scholar. Before we continue with the presentation, I want to make you aware that this talk contains a content warning and a trigger warning. As the title may imply, this presentation will address lived experiences of ableism, saneism, and sexism in academia. The material may contain interview content or pictures that may be hurtful, disturbing, or even traumatizing to some people. So if you ever feel the need to step out of the presentation, you may always do so without any consequences. Although I know that experiences of ableism and saneism vary from individual to individual, I've tried to keep harsh interview quotes to a minimum. During the presentation, I will briefly discuss some perspectives on disability and ableism, as I believe this will be important for the remainder of the talk. In line with my PhD project, I will then address the issue of performing and negotiating disability at the university and the challenges of balancing a disability and academia. The talk will conclude with personal elements that help me navigate the ableist and neurotypical academy. Of course, these aspects are not complete, and I would be happy to discuss ideas and perspective together afterwards. While exploring the term disability and the question of what disability means, most prominently I encountered the so-called social model of disability. The social model of disability distinguishes between the medically or psychologically diagnosable impairment on the one side and the socially constituted disability on the other side. In this perspective, people are not disabled because of their health impairments, chronic illnesses, or neurodivergent conditions. They are made disabled by society, which assigns them marginalized positions and creates structural, social, and communicative barriers. Therefore, the social model of disability focuses primarily on social structures, institutions, and practices that prevent disabled people from participating in everyday life on an equal basis and without discrimination. Disability is thus placed in the context of discrimination, oppression, and exclusion. At the same time, the model emphasizes that it is not the individual, but society which needs to change and remove its disabling structures and barriers. In this regard, disability is a social construct and a category of analysis. It is also a social process and a form of social inequality experienced by individuals despite non-discriminatory regulations and universal rights for disabled people. In my research, I'm particularly interested in lived experiences of ableism in academia. So for today's presentation, this raises the question of what I mean when talking about ableism. With ableism, disability studies have developed a concept that describes and addresses disability-specific forms of discrimination. The core of ableism is the term ability, or to be able to. It discusses the distinguishing characteristics of ability and inability and their links with disability and impairment. Regarding the meaning of ableism, disability scholars repeatedly refer to the definition by Fiona K. Campbell. Campbell understands ableism as, and I quote, a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body that is projected as the perfect, species-typical, and therefore essential and fully human. Disability then is cast as the diminished state of being human. End of quote. In her understanding of ableism, Campbell considers the normative distinction between disability and non-disability. She emphasizes that the normal is constructed in terms of what is deviant or abnormal. In this perspective, non-disabled and healthy people are elevated to the norm, to the ideal against which all bodies must prove themselves. The central point of this concept is the social orientation towards ability. Ableism refers to judging individuals regarding their physical, psychological, and neurological abilities and functions. It represents a standard of assessment that enhances, values, or devalues people based on a desired bodily and mental norm. Whether a person is considered disabled is decided on the basis of abilities, with a very flexible line as to when these abilities are considered disabled, or not disabled enough. This narrow-minded focus on typical physical, mental, and neurological abilities undoubtedly leads to discrimination and marginalization of people who are considered incapable, abnormal, or untypical. Who these deviant people are is, of course, decided by non-disabled neurotypical people. Overall, this should highlight that ableism is embedded in society's power relations and hierarchies. It includes the idea that a person's abilities or characteristics are determined by disability, and that disabled people as a group are inferior to non-disabled people. Keeping this in mind, deciding whether to disclose disability information at work is a significant challenge for disabled people. For the most part, this is because disability disclosure is neither a singular nor an isolated event. Instead, it can be understood as an ongoing process, taking place at different stages and times, involving various types of interactions. It does not happen all at once, nor does it happen once and for all, but it occurs gradually to varying degrees in different contexts and spaces. Therefore, disability disclosure is a complex and multi-level process linked to disability identity, privilege, and intersectionality. The decision to disclose an invisible condition in academia is strongly embedded in the specific work environment and culture at the university. It depends on the working conditions and the relationship of trust towards superiors and colleagues. Before academics can share any disability information or confide in individuals at work, they need to feel secure in their position or with others. On the one hand, this requires a work environment and culture where individual differences are accepted, valued, and understood. On the other hand, academics need to be sure that they will not suffer any social, physical, mental, or professional consequences for identifying as disabled. As long as the condition does not declare itself due to its severity or advanced stage, employees must consider whether it is beneficial to share disability information. They must consider what impact disclosure may have on their social relationships, mental health, and future career prospects. Therefore, disclosing an invisible disability must be understood as a cost-benefit analysis. Based on my interview study, it becomes apparent that specific symptoms or diagnoses are disclosed relatively often throughout the academics' careers. However, the extent and severity, as well as the fluctuating and episodic nature of their health conditions, are frequently concealed. On the one hand, many academics explain this with the complexity of their conditions and their insecurity about how and what to tell others about their disabilities. On the other hand, many disabled scholars do not want to be perceived as weak, unpredictable, or limited in performance. These scholars fear being pitied and patronized at work and no longer taken seriously as academics if they fully disclose their conditions. I want to highlight this situation in the following quote from a female academic with gastrointestinal disease. I quote, "I don't even know if this is a smart thing to do. I mean, he has promoted and supported me somehow. And I wonder whether you still do that with someone you look at and think, well, the poor thing, will she still be able to do this? I don't know. I rather wanted to appear a bit more productive and maybe not as weak." In this respect, disability disclosure is particularly difficult in neoliberal academia, a place where overwork and high performance are valued, holidays and sick leave are minimized, even avoided, and employees are evaluated based on their work's financial value. In an environment which is dominated by expectations of productivity and competitiveness, and where temporary short-term contracts are prevalent, many disabled employees feel they cannot be open and honest about their conditions and keep them secret. They are expected to fulfill the demands of the able-bodied and able-minded worker, who is hyper-social and hyper-communicative and can perform to an excellent standard in everything all of the time. This able normative framework leaves barely any room to admit to fluctuating health conditions and talk about disability, chronic illness, or neurodivergence. Based on my interview study, it becomes apparent that within their highly demanding workplace, most disabled scholars do not want to be seen as needy or pitiful. For this reason, they push themselves through episodes of illness. They try hard to present themselves as able-bodied and able-minded, as fitting within academia, a place where chronic and fluctuating health conditions are considered potentially undesirable and damaging to professional careers. In particular, academics on fixed-term contracts strongly hesitate to fully disclose their conditions to superiors to avoid jeopardizing their chances of permanent employment. This becomes evident in the following quote from a female academic with an autoimmune disease who is employed on a fixed-term basis. So I told him what condition I have, but I didn't say that it is fluctuating and episodic. I also didn't say that I could die from it, because I'm always afraid that the employer will see some disadvantage for keeping me in academia in the long term. Disability disclosure in academia does not only pose a challenge for disabled people in general. In particular, it is difficult for queer people with disabilities, neurodivergent people, female scholars, and scholars with mental illness. In this regard, research shows that queer students with disabilities preferably choose to disclose strategically and contextually. This largely depends on whether their disability or queer identities are accepted and valued on campus, and whether they aim for a specific goal with disclosure. In particular, neurodivergent trans students and trans students with mental illness choose not to disclose their identities to avoid stigma and unanticipated consequences. These results are similar to the experiences of neurodivergent students in general. Research shows that autistic students reject disclosure because they wish to develop independence and their new social identity, whilst others are concerned about the impact on their privacy and the lack of supportive policies. For dyslexic students, non-disclosure is fueled by fear of being stigmatized, separated from the class, and not being able to get good grades. ADHD students tend not to disclose because they do not feel the need to do so, because they do not anticipate any benefits if they do. As long as they can control or hide their conditions well, these students often see no reason to discuss it with professors or fellow students. Concerning academic employment, non-tenured female academics are less likely to disclose their disabilities due to fear of negative consequences for their professional careers. These scholars choose not to share disability information to avoid becoming vulnerable to other people's prejudices. Women's disclosures are generally met with less understanding than men's, which further highlights that disability disclosure in academia is not an isolated, but an intersectional issue. To avoid being stigmatized as unreliable, crazy, or dangerous, and being mistreated by others, academics with mental illness often feel unwilling or unable to share disability information. They frequently are concerned that disability disclosure may affect tenure and promotion at the university, or factors such as salary and benefits. They are also afraid of not having their contract renewed or losing their job once they have disclosed their conditions. Consequently, academics with mental illness often choose to keep up appearances and fit in instead of revealing themselves as other. This emotional distress becomes apparent in the following quote from a female academic with mental illness. I quote, "I don't want them to think I am unreliable or incapable, or that I'm different. I already feel different anyway. I don't want them to think that I'm crazy. I was definitely afraid that if I came out completely, it would affect my career at the university. I was already scared of attending therapy, that I won't get tenure anymore." When discussing balancing disability and academia, it is essential to address the concept of crib time at this point. When talking about crib time, disabled people mean living with, caring for, and valuing disabled bodies. On the one hand, crib time involves managing symptoms of conditions, taking medication and other medical support services, and attending regular doctor or therapy appointments. On the other hand, Crib time means taking time to do something beautiful and creative, taking time to sleep and rest, to recharge, not for the sake of work, but for valuing your body and mind. Disabled, and especially neurodivergent people, have their own understanding and feeling of time. A concept of time that is not as linear as the academy mandates. In contrast, disabled academics are frequently confronted with highly competitive work culture, toxic performance expectations, and precarious employment conditions. They need to present and publish their work results as quickly as possible, acquire as much research funds as possible, teach as many classes as possible, and organize as many events as possible. They are embedded in a pressurized work environment where overwork, overload, and time restraints are normalized. For many disabled scholars, balancing disability needs and academic workload is strongly supported by flexible and accessible work arrangements. This involves working from home and at different times of the day, having the chance to relax and take breaks between work and appointments. It also includes the possibility of working in a fully accessible workplace, so they don't have to spend time and energy asking for accommodations and additional support. However, this balancing act is made difficult by power relations and hierarchical structures. Social and economic dependencies enable these practices within the academy. In my interview study, this is evident in the narrative of a scholar with mental illness who returns to university after taking a 9-month break due to deteriorating health. While the participant believes his supervisor will greet him on his return and ask how she can accommodate his re-entry, the interviewee is confronted with the exact opposite and even ends up losing his job. I quote, "But she beat me up for half an hour, saying, 'The amount of work you left here. I even had to hire a student assistant to read your term papers. Do you realize that?' And then somehow, a month later, I had an email, a 2-liner from the secretary that, unfortunately, my contract cannot be renewed." During their careers, many participants have internalized neoliberal performance and productivity standards. Most of them feel stressed, exhausted, and pressured to perform, to function, and meet the demands and expectations of their superiors. They often internalize the notion that disabled academics are less efficient, reliable, and capable than non-disabled scholars. As a result, they work hard to prove themselves as equally productive, competitive, and available as their non-disabled peers, as fitting within their abled normative work environment. In this respect, they are forced to cross or push their physical and mental boundaries, not to oppose the dominant image of the hyper-productive and efficient worker. This critical situation is highlighted in the following quote from a female academic with an autoimmune disease. I quote, "Yes, the pressure of having to function somehow, and of course, I always have to produce excellent results so that I can justify being here. I think I've been truly suffering from burnout for quite a while now, and I'm just exhausted. I can't do anything anymore, and I haven't been able to do anything for a long time." Concerning disability, chronic illness, and neurodivergence, we can identify 3 main characteristics of academia. First of all, a neoliberal academia that fosters a culture of high performance, overwork, hyperproductivity, and hypermobility. Secondly, an ableist academia that creates emotional distress and pressure for people with disabilities to navigate its spaces and times. And a neurotypical academia that prides itself on cerebral work, linear time, as well as social and communicative hyperability. During my presentation, my objective was to illustrate that academic power relations and hierarchical structures strongly contribute to these ableist and neurotypical working conditions. For this reason, a structural and cultural change in higher education is needed to tackle or dissolve these issues and to create an inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory academy for everyone. The question is how? And I would like to use this last slide, or the two last slides, to highlight aspects that help me personally and which I believe are important to tackle ableist and neurotypical working cultures. First and foremost, it is important, and I think this is applicable to this network here, to create neurodivergent communities, as well as inclusive research and learning networks. This involves establishing neurodivergent communities of students, scholars, and staff online and safely on campus. Promoting research by neurodivergent people for neurodivergent people. And building networks, exchanging ideas, and creating sources of knowledge. Secondly, what I found most important are peer mentoring and peer counseling programs. It is important to learn from the lived experiences and the knowledge of disabled people in higher education with intersecting identities from different backgrounds and different disciplines. These peer mentoring and peer counseling programs are not, or should not be considered as a substitute for any psychological or medical professions, but as a source of support and understanding and a collaborative, non-hierarchical space. Thirdly, and this applies maybe to all of our experiences, what is important that universities engage in decolonization, intersectionality, and accessibility, including the voices and perspectives of people with intersecting and marginalized identities in research, teaching, workshops, and talks, not only when celebrating History Month or Awareness Weeks, but regularly and permanently. Including the lived experiences of Black people and people of color with disabilities, transgender and genderqueer people with disabilities, and disabled people from non-academic and low-income households. Even though I'm speaking here today as a gay, disabled, and first-generation academic from a low-income family, I was still privileged enough to have a comparatively easy academic journey due to being a white cis man from the global north. This complex of decolonization, intersectionality, and accessibility is highly connected to the production of knowledge, whose knowledge is shared within university contexts, which people are sharing this knowledge, and who has the opportunity and privilege to access and gain a certain kind of knowledge. This is, of course, linked to creating inclusive virtual and physical spaces, creating access to knowledge and information in university contexts, creating an inclusive and non-discriminatory academy for all disabled and neurodivergent people. Last, but definitely not least, it is important that people who are in privileged situations and university members in general try to engage in activism and social justice following participatory approaches. This includes raising awareness and tackling social injustices through collaborative research, through teaching and training, through collective events and actions. Speaking up for accessibility and disability justice with disabled people. Involving the perspective of disabled people when designing training courses, organizing events, or designing the teaching curriculum, According to the motto of the disability movement, nothing about us without us. Mainly, but not limited to the social sciences and humanities, this means exploring the lived experiences of disabled and neurodivergent people in higher education through research, through participatory research, where disabled and neurodivergent people are involved in every step of the research process. For universities, this means offering the financial means and willingness to conduct this kind of disability-led research. And most importantly, this means accepting, appreciating, and supporting disabled and neurodivergent people at all levels of higher education. Referring to the latter, I would like to finish my presentation with a quote from a blog post I wrote last year. I quote, "I am a reliable academic, even though, or precisely because I set myself limits and regularly take care of my body and mind. And I'm a serious and normal academic, even though I go to therapy, take antidepressants and other medication, and live and work with ADHD and depression." So, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and for attending the talk. And I'm happy to answer any questions and exchange ideas in a mutual discussion. Thank you very much.